on the computer. Okay, we are now recording. Just so everybody knows, the reason we're recording is so that anybody in the future can see this, or if you happen to get logged off on accidentally or whatever, you can go back and watch it again. Or if you really just want to hear Gary talk again, you totally can watch this again. This is a live Zoom event. The thing we ask of everybody is if you could possibly mute yourselves, which is the lower left-hand corner, looks just like a microphone. While Gary is talking, that'd be great. And then you will be able to unmute yourself if Gary asks a question, or towards the end when Gary allows for questioning. You can also put your questions in the chat. My name is Becky. I am the head of Archives and Special Collections here in the local history room at Decatur Public Library. And we welcome you to the Remembering the Decatur Firestone Plant live Zoom event with Gary Geisler. And of course, most of you probably know who Gary is. Gary is a lawyer in town, well-known lawyer, and also an avid historian. And he's been doing a bunch of different things for us lately. He used to volunteer in the local history room. And then his last Zoom event was dentist school about a month ago. So, and you'll find that on our YouTube page. We'll be happy to have you look at that. Please and thank you. Gary, you want to take it over?
All right, thank you. Thank you, Becky. Good evening to everybody. Thank you for joining us for the discussion of the Decatur Firestone Plant. It's another important story for those of us in Decatur. The measure of a community is not the population or the wealth of the community, but rather it's the people and the things that bond the people together. And the Firestone Plant was one of those kinds of places that really bonded together people here in Decatur. On June the 27th, 2001, it was reported on the CBS Evening News. And the next day it was reported on the financial news pages of the New York Times newspaper, the Los Angeles Times, and across America. The Firestone Plant in Decatur, Illinois was being closed down. It was big news in the United States, and it was much bigger news in Decatur.
Family, only on the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather.
Japan's Bridgestone company announced today it will shut down the Illinois factory that made many of the millions of Firestone tires recalled over the past year. The Decatur plant employs 1,500 people, producing about 10% of the Bridgestone and Firestone tires made in North America. It is to be closed by the end of the year. When it comes to
In Decatur, it was splashed across the front page of the newspaper, and there were multiple pages of the newspaper dedicated to the Decatur Firestone Plant and its closing. The Herald and Review had devoted a substantial portion of the newspaper years prior, on February the 14th, 1988, to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Firestone Plant, and the plant had an open house for the community that day. The existence of the Decatur Firestone Plant was part of the historical fiber of our town. Let's turn the clock back even further to 1962. The plant out on 22nd Street had been used to build tank engines during World War II, and at the end of the war, the plant became the Signal Depot. The Signal Depot was operated here from 1946 until 1960. It was an electronic distribution center. There were some offers made when the government put the factory up for sale, and then Firestone came forth with a bid for $2.5 million. And the Firestone company bought the plant. Local attorney Tom Armstrong represented Firestone in the purchase. At first, Firestone was unclear whether it would be a storage facility or a tire manufacturing plant. An interesting thing about Firestone coming to Decatur is that the Firestone family had been here on June the 25th, 1921, for the wedding of Decatur native Elizabeth Park and Harvey S. Firestone Jr., the son of the founder of Firestone. The ceremony was at St. John's Episcopal Church here in Decatur, followed by a reception of 225 guests at the Country Club of Decatur. The newlyweds took a honeymoon to Canada, which was topped off with a week at a resort just outside of Washington, D.C., compliments of President Warren G. Harding. and they were joined by the Henry Fords and the Thomas Edisons. Harvey S. Firestone Jr. became the CEO and the president of the company in 1948, and he made periodic visits to Decatur, even before we had a plant, including being the keynote speaker for the United Fund Drive in 1958. The Firestone family came to Decatur for the grand opening of the plant in 1963, and it was announced that the Decatur Firestone tire plant was the largest in the United States. At first, the plant opened with 400 plant workers, and they were making 7,000 tires a day. The first tire was turned out on February the 14th, 1963, and the 500th tire on September 20th of that year. On September the 26th, they turned out the 1 millionth tire, and Decatur Mayor Ellis Arnold was at the plant for a ceremony. The plant was already turning out 10,000 tires a day with a workforce of 525. In May 1964, the Decatur Firestone plant was dedicated with a 3-day ceremony. The Firestone family and chief executives were in attendance, as was Illinois Governor Otto Kerner. Production was already up to 12,000 tires a day, and Governor Kerner declared May 12th Firestone Day in this entire state of Illinois. 18,000 people from Decatur toured the plant during those 3 days. In the Firestone annual report released in 1966, it was announced that the company's profits had increased over 17% and the sales had increased over 13%. And Firestone tires had been on the winning car in the Indy 500 race for 43 consecutive years. Our Firestone plant was a community within a community. The Firestone workers in Decatur had golf league teams, softball league teams. They helped sponsor the Firestone JFL field. They held picnics and events. They celebrated birthdays and anniversaries right there in the plant. They even had a bathtub boat race across Lake Decatur. And they treated fellow plant workers like an extended family. I want to skip ahead now to February of 1988, the 25th anniversary of the plant. At that point, there were 1,500 hourly employees at the plant and over 300 salary employees. And they were turning out over 25,000 tires a day. The community again was invited to tour the plant. 2 winning Indy 500 race cars were on display. And the Decatur newspaper had a souvenir edition section, an entire section of the newspaper devoted to the plant. The company was already in the process of modernizing the plant, and they were spending over $40 million to retool the plant. In 1995, John Bettner was retiring as the manager of the Decatur Firestone plant, and he was interviewed by the newspaper. He said the plant can carve out a great future for itself and the company's plans. He said it makes sense to expand in Decatur just by adding and upgrading equipment without the need for any construction. And he said that the company was looking at increasing production to 30,000 tires a day. In 1999, Firestone added 20 new tire-making machines, and they boosted the tire-making production at the plant to 28,000 tires a day. Plant manager Harry McMillan told the newspaper, "Decatur is here to stay." On September 20, 2000, the Decatur Firestone plant manager, again Harry McMillan, told the newspaper there was no current plans to close the Decatur plant. At that time, the plant employed 2,100 people. Due to the increased inventory and reduced sales, however, production was then cut down to 23,500 tires a day. On November the 24th of 2000, the Decatur newspaper carried an editorial with the caption, "Positive signs exist for Firestone." At that point, the company was known as Bridgestone Firestone, and they had laid off over 1,000 employees at the plants in Oklahoma and Tennessee. In October, the plant had announced the layoff of 25% of the Decatur employees from our work crew at that point of 1,950. And the plant was temporarily shut down from December 14th to January the 2nd. And finally, on Thursday, June 28, 2001, the headline of the Decatur newspaper was, "Firestone Chapter Ends." The company cited weak demand and the factory's age in the decision to close its plant in Decatur. A separate article was titled, "Union Leaders and Workers Blindsided by News," and on the editorial page, an op-ed was titled, "Firestone Closing, No Cause for Panic." What went wrong? How did this large industrious manufacturing plant in Decatur that had employed over 2,000 people and had produced as many as 28,000 tires a day end up being shuttered? How is it that 2,000 families in Decatur relied upon their loved one to go to that plant every working day, and that a community would rely on the commerce that a large plant brings to a community with its employees buying groceries, clothes, cars, gas, and needing banks, doctors, lawyers? The excitement that all of Decatur felt back in 1962 with the announcement of the Firestone Plant, and the celebration and the tours of the plant in 1964 and again in 1988. The Firestone Plant was as much a part of the fiber of Decatur as was the Chicago Bears getting their start here in Decatur. Firestone was here for over 38 years. So what did go wrong? Stick with me now, because this may not end quite like you think it will, but we've got to dig through some of the dirt to get the entire story out. Let's back up to 1988. On March 8, 1988, our newspaper carried a story that Pirelli, an Italian tire maker, was taking aim at Firestone. There was a buyout effort by Pirelli at $1.86 billion. Just 10 days later, Bridgestone made an offer at $2.6 billion, which was ultimately accepted. Pirelli had offered $58 a share, and Bridgestone topped that by offering $80 a share. An important factor to know is that Bridgestone, a Japanese company, had to borrow $2 billion to buy Firestone and become the largest tire maker in the world. How does a going business suddenly take on $2 billion of debt? It should be noted that after the buyout, Bridgestone began having advisors in the U.S. Firestone plants. And I mean as many as 20 advisors in the plant at a time in the beginning. That number was reduced, but it always existed. An additional layer of manpower, but these people were brought here by Bridgestone. Bridgestone wanted to assure that the Firestone plants were being operated at the highest efficiency and production levels. On the local level, the United Rubber Workers Union went out on strike on May the 15th, 1988, 2 months to the day of the Bridgestone buyout offer. Think of this now. On one hand, you have the company that is trying to contract the benefits, and on the other side, they've just paid $2.6 billion for the company. Let me stop again and point something out about how pivotal 1988 was for Firestone locally. The plant had existed for almost 26 years at that point, and the plant would remain open under Bridgestone for almost another 13 years. So under the first 2/3 of the life of the Firestone plant, it was operated under the Firestone umbrella, and for the last third, it was under Bridgestone Firestone. If you look at the articles about the Firestone plant run in the local newspaper, the overwhelming stories for the first 26 years were relatively upbeat and positive. And for the last 13 years, the tone of the overwhelming majority of the articles would not be what I would call upbeat. And this influenced the average opinion of indicator about the Firestone plant and the impression of what was going on. And I believe it was unfairly done so. Let's talk some more. The connection between Firestone and Ford had been close-knit since before World War I. The Firestones and the Fords were friends, and the Firestone tires were on the Fords from the start. Let's bring in the Ford Explorer. Ford had the Ford Bronco too, and it had a high center of gravity and was not all that safe. In 1990, Ford introduced the Ford Explorer, its smaller SUV entry. The gas tank and the spare tire in the back, and loading it with cargo, and you had stress on the tires. Now the concern was to have a soft ride, but also long-lasting tires. So the Ford executives were pressing the Firestone executives for the soft ride, but long-lasting tires. Meanwhile, Ford had created a design by taking an SUV cabin and attaching it to a Ford Ranger undercarriage, cost savings because they were not creating a new undercarriage. However, the added upper cabin weight created a higher center of gravity and was more likely to roll over. After the Explorer rolled over in company tests, even prior to production, Ford engineers decided to lower the suspension and to reduce the air pressure in the tires. A consequence of lowering the air pressure was to increase higher temperatures, which could lead or contribute to tire failure. Most of the tire failures were on the left rear side, and that was closest to the exhaust, which was hotter than the other three tires. And it should be noted that more tire failures occurred in hot weather climates like Florida, Texas, Arizona, and California. The Firestone and Ford Explorer tire controversy was linked to 271 fatalities and over 800 injuries in the United States. The problem was one of tread separation of the ATX, the ATX2, and the Wilderness AT Firestone tires, which were installed on the Ford Explorer and other similar vehicles. In March of 2000, the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration began a preliminary inquiry, which became a full-blown investigation on May the 2nd, 2000. On August the 9th, 2000, Firestone issued a recall of 6.5 million tires. Ford voluntarily recalled 13 million Firestone tires on May the 21st of 2001. Those of us in Decatur read so much about labor unrest in the 90s, and there had been wide speculation that the Firestone tire problems might be connected to the labor unrest. In January 1994, Firestone and the URW entered into a new contract negotiations with Firestone demanding considerable concessions from the union. In July, the URW called a general strike in Decatur and 4 other Firestone plants. Firestone immediately began hiring replacement workers who were paid 30% less. And the tires made between 1994 and 1996 were most prone to have tread separation or delamination. And the URW did settle, and they did accept accessions. So what were the primary causes for the tread separation? Which raises a secondary question of whether these tires were ever the correct tire for the Ford Explorer. Obviously, operating temperature was a factor resulting from lower inflation, weight, exhaust, and climate. Heat affects the overall life of the tire components, but especially the adhesive qualities of the tire, and that goes directly to tread separation. Secondly, the age of the tire. Firestone was using a hard rubber in its tread consistent with truck tires and creating greater mileage, but at the same time, that created greater wear on the other components of the tire. Thirdly, tire design. The belt wedge gauge for the ATX and the Wilderness AT tires was less than for comparable tires of other tire manufacturers. The wedge gauge was less than the Firestone's own standards, and a lesser belt wedge is a design factor in the bonding of the tread to the tire carcass. Adhesion tests showed that the Wilderness AT tires were weaker than a similar tire made by other companies. So you had a design problem. Fourthly, circumstances unique to a particular plant. This is the least scientific potential cause for the tire failures. There is absolutely never any evidence of any intentional effort to damage tires. There was some question about the use of substandard materials such as products that were not properly stored and maintained. And fifth, decisions made on the corporate levels of Bridgestone and Firestone, which I will get to. This brings us to the plant shutdown in December 2001 and the question of why the company shut down the Decatur plant. Bridgestone announced that the cause was the aging of the plant and the decline in market demand. Was that so? The Decatur Firestone plant was a large manufacturing series of buildings. Regular maintenance was done. The equipment and machinery was gone through 2 separate modernizations during the life of the plant, and the machinery was not outdated. In fact, it was again used in other plants. The workforce at Decatur was never documented to be less capable. In fact, the workforce of 2001 was highly experienced and skilled. So what else entered into the decision to shut down the Decatur Firestone plant? Well, we go back to 1988 and the buyout by Bridgestone, the burden of paying the $2 million of debt by the company. And here's what we know at the time that the Firestone plant was closed down. The litigation over the Ford Explorer rollovers and the congressional investigation led by Senator John McCain resulted in massive discovery efforts to discover what was going on at the corporate level, and here is what they found. In 1995, in an attempt to reduce the massive debt, and remember 1995 is a key year here with their tire problems, Bridgestone authorized the U.S. operations to secretly implement an unprecedented tire manufacturing cost reduction program called C95. The program resulted in a reduction of the production costs of Firestone tires by 26% over 4 years. The C95 program was signed off by Masatoshi Ono and was in the nature of a directive to John Lamp, the CEO of Bridgestone Firestone Inc. And it had been further discovered that the C95 program was really intended to buy time so that Bridgestone could ultimately shift more of their Firestone production to China and Brazil. The C95 program has been referred to as de-engineering. Among the steps taken under the C95 included reducing the natural rubber content in tire components, using reduced gauge calender steel cord, reducing tire inner liner gauge, reducing the wedge gauge, and reducing curing times. In sum, the quality of the Firestone tire was reduced. Putting the entire picture together, Decatur lost the Firestone plant in 2001, not as a result of union unrest, and not as a result of faulty work at the plant, but rather because of design flaws by Firestone and Ford on their corporate levels, and by the flawed economic planning by the Bridgestone company in buying out the Firestone company and then taking steps for purely economic reasons, which resulted in a less quality product. In summation, the Decatur Firestone plant was a huge asset of our community for almost 39 years. The people who worked at the plant were among our friends and our neighbors. The closing down of the plant was as a result of bad decision-making on the corporate level outside of Decatur. But the memory of the Firestone plant will remain a large part of the historical fabric of Decatur. And now I'd like to allow anybody who has any memories to share with us or stories to share with us about the Firestone plant, please do so.
Hey, Gary, Mark Wassam in Dallas. Can you hear me, please?
I can, Mark. Thank you.
A brilliant history on the Firestone plant. I have a couple of questions. Let's go back further, and you made reference to this, and that is my parents, grandparents always called it the Signal Depot before Firestone bought it. What are your recollections, research about the Signal Depot? It always seemed to me like they might be involved in top secret stuff. I don't know.
Okay, so yeah, thank you for that question. So, of course, the government was already involved in the plan at that point because of the war production. And as the war was coming to an end, there was a decision made that we had so many military bases across the country that the military decided that they needed 4 signal depots spread out across the country. Decatur was one of the 4 locations, and Decatur was assigned 13 states. So for all of the military operations in 13 states, they relied upon Decatur to supply them with any type of electronic devices, communication devices, and so forth. Now, some of that might have been highly secretive type of things. I don't know. Or, it might have been, telephone systems. It might be radar, those kinds of things. But that's over a very large area. So you had a lot of materials that were going in and out of the signal depot and going to military bases.
Fascinating, fascinating. Second question, changing paradigms entirely. During the Firestone plant's shutdown, there was some sources that blamed the Decatur plant on the failed tires on the Ford Explorers. You've already talked about that, but just one more time, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that issue.
Well, and I'll give you the benefit of my thoughts, and if there's anybody online who worked at the plant, please add your thoughts as well. The tire failures that were going on really focused on 1995 and the time shortly before that and shortly after that. But that really was the greatest period of focus for the failures that were taking place. And it is true statistically that Decatur had more failures than the other plants. However, Decatur, I think, focused more on their production of those particular tires as well. So that may explain it partially. But the design problems that were going on was a huge part of the failure. One thing that I should point out is that when the litigation got started and when these tire problems were so much in the news, there were two employees who were inside the Bridgestone Firestone corporate family who worked in research and development. One of the fellows' last name was Orr, and I don't recall the other one's last name. But they were sending corporate memos out talking about these design failures of these particular tires that were going on the Ford Explorer. And Firestone had to get them out because they couldn't tolerate them continuing to send these memos, so they were both fired. Well, Orr ended up being an expert witness to testify against Firestone. I'll back up and I'll tell you that all of this litigation involving Firestone, the insurance companies, I think State Farm was one of the insurance companies that started sounding the alarms about what was going on. But in about 1998, I believe was the year, China sent some of their top scientists to the United States to study our hospitals, our medical schools, basically how we handle our health system in the United States. And our government had approved them coming here to study our system. Their top people were on a van, in a Ford van out in California on, I think it was I-15, and had Firestone tires on it. One of the rear Firestone tires delaminated. The vehicle rolled over. 2 of their scientists were killed, and 3 other scientists were seriously injured. It was a huge, huge disaster for China. There was a big lawsuit that got filed. And as I say, Orr, who had been fired by Firestone, he was the one that not only blew the whistle on all the design flaws, but he also testified about this C95 program to reduce the manufacturing costs. So that's where the C95 came from. And there's also, today I was reading a decision in one of the federal cases involving Orr was trying to get reinstated or suing for wrongful being fired by Firestone. And there's reference in that federal case to the C95 program as well.
Gary, phenomenal research. Phenomenal research. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments, anything, any stories anybody would share with us?
Yeah, I'm Bill. This was my first Zoom at the library, and I'm not really up to skill on this, but I tried to get you on my smartphone, which I'm on my smartphone now and on my computer, and I wasn't able to get the sound on my smartphone. I didn't have the code for my smartphone. Anyway, I don't want to mess with your presentation, but I did want to give you that input.
Okay, Bill, this is being recorded also, and if you'd like to see it again, you'll be able to go through the library to do so, if you missed part of it. Is Hugh good online? Hugh, are you out there?
Bill, you got on and did a great job. You've been here pretty much the whole time, and we appreciate you being here. I can send you the link out to this video if you'd like, if you missed anything. I just need your email address.
It was a wonderful presentation, Gary. I want to thank you so much.
Thanks, Bill.
Gary, this is Mike Fair.
Yeah, Mike.
I drove past Firestone today, as a matter of fact, and I looked over at it as I drove past it, and I just can't believe how it's decimated. It is completely gone now, almost. My mom worked there for 25 years. She retired from there in, 2001 when the plant shut down. She was a bead builder, and some of the stories that you've been, or not stories, some of the facts that you have brought up, she had told me about, reference to C95, and a few other things to go along with it. It was claimed that during that strike period is when those tires were made. And this is what my mother told me. Those tires were made during that time frame because they have a time and date stamp on every tire. But that was a very good presentation. It brought back me some memories of Mom and what she used to do out there.
Mike, thank you. I wish Rose was here today, and I wish she was online with us, because you and I know she'd tell it the way it was. No doubt about
You
that.
daggone Skipper.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. You know, I tell you, one of the incredible things, and it really was kind of a small piece of the presentation, but I have to tell you, Firestone, when they closed, there was 3 big boxes full of materials that they had that they gave to the local history room at the library. That 4 boxes. What did I say? 3? I guess 4. Yes. And so much of that was pictures of activities that the employees did. It was, you could just sense that these people that worked at that Firestone plant, it was a close-knit group, and they had their own newspaper, you know, that told stories about the people. Yvonne Stroud was one of the people who was, I don't know if you call her the editor, but one of the people who helped put together that newspaper. I tell you, we sure miss having the Firestone plant in Decatur. It's a shame it isn't still here.
Mark Wassam back in Dallas. I could not agree with you more. Born in 1952, graduated MacArthur High School in 1970, Millikan University in 1974, and I, for one, miss the Firestone plant no longer being in Decatur.
No.
Okay, thank you all for joining us. Is there anybody else that has any comment?
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. Do you know anything about the future? You know, we all drive by there and it looks like they're tearing down portions of the plant. And is the administration building going to be next, or?
Bill, I really don't know. You know, I know Strip Masters is still operating in part of the plant, and I've been in there this past summer, so you can walk in there and you can see. I mean, it still looks like, very much like the plant.
Have you been by recently though?
Well, yeah, I mean, it looks like they're tearing more buildings down. I don't know. I don't know, you know, what that's all about. I'll tell you this, one of the things I came upon, and maybe this is something that would be news to all of you, there's an underground system there. There's tunnels underground that apparently existed at the time that it was a war production plant. And there's underground tunnels that go from building to building, and also that at the time that it was a war production plant, there was a commandant's house, apparently was on the grounds, and the commandant had the ability to go into the plant underground. I don't think that any of those tunnels exist at this time. I think they were all filled in.
Gary, it's Mike again.
Yeah.
I'm sitting here thinking about that. We know that it was a signal corps before it became that, before it became in tank production. I believe Mom told me that that is what actually spawned GE a block or two down. And there used to be tunnels that went from Firestone to the GE plant.
Was the GE plant part of the war production?
Yes.
I mean, that plant was before, yeah.
Yes, that's what that is what Mom told me, and my grandmother actually worked there.
Yeah.
So that's what I was told about that also.
Gary.
Yeah, go ahead.
Gary, hi, Dave Bowman.
Hi,
In
Dave.
Florida, formerly Decatur store manager. If you have time, maybe research back in the 70s when Firestone had issues similar to Ford products, specifically the Ford Thunderbird, tire specifically made at that time when Firestone was on strike in 1976. Similar issues. Really, I don't think they can blame Firestone. Everybody had an issue at that time with radial tires, which Michelin possibly had perfected and Firestone was trying to copy. Like I said, I don't think it was an issue between the manufacturer of Firestone tires, but Ford wanted those tires to ride softly and recommended an inflation that was unreasonable for that heavy a car. I think it was probably similar to the process that happened with the Ford Explorers. Just a question I had, being with the company back at that time.
Dave, thank you. My recollection is that when we turn back to the 70s, which you made reference to, that they were using a different type of belt to the tire, that they weren't into the steel belt yet, and that they were using some kind of a synthetic material for the belt. Does that make sense? Does that?
No. When they did produce the steel radial 500, that would include steel belted radial 500. They also, GM had one they called the TPC, which is Tire Performance Criteria. It was a tire that they specifically wanted Firestone to make for their GM vehicles. Like I said, if you go back to 1976, there was a strike, and tires could not be produced fast enough to even include a spare tire. So there was an issue in production, but I, can't specifically say it was Firestone's fault.
Yeah. Thank you, Dave. Anybody else?
Well, as far as the history of the buildings and the plant, I joined the Army Reserve at the headquarters building there before it became a Firestone plant in 1954. That was used as an Army Reserve Center, part of the Firestone Administration Building.
Interesting. So from the pictures, Bill, you could see there was apparently a lot of military people who were working around the signal depot, and so that would certainly make sense that they would have reserve units there.
And then our reserve unit moved down to buildings that were where the library is now. It was the reserve center was right on the corner downtown there.
Interesting.
And of
Thank you.
course now it's back out in the Firestone area. I was never in the newer building there, but the reserve center's out there now.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, let's wrap it up. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. We're going to have some more digital discussions. One of them that Becky and I have been talking about today is to do a digital discussion about Lake Decatur. I think it's pretty fascinating about the development of Lake Decatur and how Lake Decatur has changed over the years. And I think that'd be a real interesting discussion for all of us.
I'd like to see more of the participants put their videos on. The videos the Zoom conference I've been in, I get to see a lot of people.
Yeah.
Not everybody is good with the cameras. Some people are very camera shy.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Again, this will be we'll see you in the next one. This will be posted on Facebook and on YouTube. So please follow us on Facebook or YouTube, and you'll get to see this again. And we'll also make sure that it's linked on the website as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Becky.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Great job.
Thank you.